Imagine being born free, but growing up knowing your older brothers and sisters were still enslaved, trapped in a world of brutality while you lived in safety. That was William Still's reality, and from that agonizing knowledge, he didn't just help a few people escape slavery. He architected the most sophisticated freedom network in American history, personally guiding over 800 enslaved people to liberty, reunited with a brother he'd never met after 40 years of separation, became a wealthy businessman, and wrote the book that preserved the Underground Railroad's history for generations. He went from working as a janitor and clerk to being called the father of the Underground Railroad. But here's what I want you to think about as we go through this story. How did someone with almost no formal education, working a menial job, build a system so effective that it saved hundreds of lives while outsmarting the most powerful slave catchers in America? Stay until the end, because the answer reveals a strategy you can use in your own life, no matter what obstacles you're facing right now. To understand William Still's transformation, you have to start with his mother's impossible choice. Her name was Charity, though she was born Sydney Steele, and she was enslaved on a Maryland plantation with her 4 children. Her husband Levin had already escaped, purchased his own freedom in 1798, and made it to New Jersey. He was waiting for her. He was free, but she and their children were still trapped. So Charity made her first attempt. She took all 4 children and ran. Can you imagine that? 4 kids trying to move quietly through the night, trying to keep them calm, trying to keep them silent. They didn't make it. They were captured, dragged back. And the punishment for trying to escape wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It was the knowledge that you'd failed, that your children would grow up enslaved because you couldn't get them out. But Charity didn't give up. She planned a second escape, and this time she made a decision that would haunt her family for decades. She left 2 of her children behind. 2 of her babies stayed enslaved in Maryland, while she escaped with the other 2. Historical records show she successfully reached New Jersey and reunited with Levin. They changed their last name from Steele to Still, trying to avoid recapture. But those 2 children she left behind, they remained in slavery. Think about that choice. What do you take with you? Who do you leave behind? There's no good answer. There's only survival and guilt and hope that somehow, someday, you'll find them again. She was free, but not whole. Her family was split across the Mason-Dixon line, half in freedom, half in bondage. The 2 children left behind were Peter and Levin Jr. They grew up enslaved in Maryland, then were sold further south. Peter ended up in Alabama. Levin Jr.'s fate remains less documented, lost to the historical record like so many enslaved people whose stories were never preserved. Charity and Levin Sr. built a new life in Burlington County, New Jersey, but the absence of those 2 children was a wound that never healed. They talked about them, they wondered about them, they hoped they were still alive. William Still was born free in Burlington County, New Jersey, on October 7, 1821. He was the youngest of 18 children, and he would grow up knowing they were out there. His parents didn't hide this from him. They taught pride, but they also taught William that freedom wasn't guaranteed, that it could be stolen, that his own brothers and sisters were living proof that your family could be ripped apart by a system that saw human beings as property. William had little formal education. This wasn't unusual for a free black child in 1820s New Jersey. Schools were segregated when they existed at all. Opportunities were limited, resources were scarce. But William studied whenever he could. He read everything he could get his hands on. He borrowed books. He taught himself. Years later, in 1867, he'd write to his daughter mentioning he was reading Macaulay's History of England with great interest. This was a man who educated himself because the system wouldn't do it for him. He understood that knowledge was power, that literacy was freedom, that education was the foundation for everything else he wanted to accomplish. Growing up in Burlington County, William worked on his family's farm. The Still family wasn't wealthy. They were working people, farming people, trying to build something stable in a world that was hostile to black success. William learned the value of hard work from his parents. He learned persistence. He learned that you don't wait for opportunities to come to you. You create them. At age 23 in 1844, William left rural New Jersey and moved to Philadelphia. He was looking for work, looking for opportunity, looking for something more than what Burlington County could offer. Philadelphia was a city of possibility and danger for Black Americans. It was in the North, technically free territory, but the Fugitive Slave Act meant that slave catchers could operate there legally. Free black people could be kidnapped and sold south. Your papers proving your freedom could be ignored. Your testimony in court was often inadmissible. Freedom in Philadelphia was precarious, always under threat. For 3 years, William worked odd jobs, trying to establish himself. He did manual labor. He worked in service positions. He took whatever employment he could find. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what he'd hoped for when he left New Jersey. But he was building something. He was learning the city. He was making connections. He was positioning himself. Then, in 1847, something changed. He got hired by the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. His job title? Clerk and janitor. He was doing clerical work and mopping floors. It wasn't prestigious, but it put him in the right place at the right time. The Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery wasn't just a social club. It was an active organization helping fugitive slaves who made it to Philadelphia. And William Still, the clerk and janitor, started helping. He provided shelter. He helped people navigate farther north. He listened to their stories, and something clicked. This wasn't just work, this was his calling. These were people like his siblings, like his mother had been, fighting for the same freedom his family had won. Soon after his 1847 hiring, William transitioned from clerk to conductor. He became chairman of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, which had been established back in 1838 specifically to guard escaped enslaved individuals from bounty hunters. Philadelphia was a major hub on the Underground Railroad, and William Still became its most important operator. This wasn't a promotion he applied for. It was a role he grew into, a responsibility he accepted because he understood what was at stake. Now, let me be clear about what the Underground Railroad actually was. It wasn't a railroad. There were no tracks, no trains. It was a network of people, safe houses, and routes that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Conductors like William Still coordinated these escapes. They found safe houses. They arranged transportation. They provided food, clothing, money. They connected freedom seekers with the next station on the route north. And they did all of this knowing that if they were caught, they'd face serious legal consequences. Prison time, fines, violence from slave catchers, social ostracism from white neighbors who supported slavery. Still directed a complex network stretching from Philadelphia to southern regions. He worked with other conductors, with sympathizers, with people who believed slavery was evil and were willing to risk everything to fight it. He coordinated with conductors in other cities. Levi Coffin in Cincinnati, Lewis Hayden in Boston, David Ruggles in New York. These men formed a communication network that moved information as quickly as it moved people. They shared intelligence about which routes were safe, which slave catchers were operating in which cities, which safe houses had been compromised. And here's what made William Still different from almost every other conductor. He kept records, detailed, meticulous, dangerous records. Think about how risky this was. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it a federal crime to help escaped slaves. By all, if authorities found William's records, they'd have evidence of hundreds of crimes. They'd have names, routes, methods. They could arrest him. They could arrest everyone in his network. They could track down the people he'd helped and drag them back to slavery. Keeping written documentation was incredibly dangerous. But Still did it anyway. He interviewed each person who came through his station, every single one. He documented their brief biography, where they came from, where they were going, what alias they'd adopted for safety, what their real name was, who they'd left behind, what their enslavers had done to them. He was creating a historical record in real time, preserving stories that would otherwise be lost forever. According to his own accounts, he understood he wasn't just helping people escape. He was documenting a movement, memorializing black resistance during a period when those stories were systematically erased. Between the late 1840s and early 1860s, William Still helped approximately 800 enslaved people reach freedom, 800 human beings who would have lived and died in bondage if not for his network. Each one had a story, each one had a name. And Still made sure those stories and names were preserved. One of the most famous escapes he facilitated happened on March 23, 1849. A wooden box arrived in Philadelphia. It was 3 feet long, 2.5 feet deep, 2 feet wide. Inside was a man named Henry Brown. Henry had literally mailed himself to freedom. He'd arranged to be shipped as cargo, cramped in that tiny box for 27 hours, traveling by wagon and railroad from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia. When William Still and other abolitionists opened the box, Henry Brown emerged, alive but barely. He'd survived one of the most audacious escape attempts in Underground Railroad history. And William Still was there to receive him, to welcome him to freedom, to help him start his new life. Henry Brown became known as Henry Box Brown, and his story became a symbol of the desperate ingenuity of people fighting for freedom. But Henry Box Brown wasn't the only dramatic escape William Still facilitated. There was Jane Johnson, a woman enslaved to John Wheeler, the American ambassador to Nicaragua. In July 1855, Wheeler was traveling through Philadelphia with Jane and her 2 children, planning to take them to Nicaragua. William Still learned about this. He coordinated with other abolitionists. They met the family at the dock. They informed Jane that she was on free soil, that Pennsylvania law said she was free. Jane chose freedom. She and her children escaped right there, in broad daylight, with Wheeler watching helplessly. Wheeler tried to have Still and the other rescuers arrested. There was a trial. William Still was acquitted. Jane Johnson and her children remained free. It was a public victory, a demonstration that the Underground Railroad could operate even in plain sight. Then there was the Williamson case connected to Jane Johnson's escape. Passmore Williamson, a white abolitionist who'd helped with the rescue, was imprisoned for contempt of court when he refused to produce Jane Johnson. He spent months in jail. Still visited him regularly, brought him food and books, kept his spirits up. The case became national news. It demonstrated the risks that conductors faced, the legal persecution they endured. But it also showed their commitment. Williamson could have given up Jane Johnson's location. He could have cooperated with authorities. He chose prison instead, and William supported him throughout. There was also the escape of a family from Maryland, a mother and her 3 children who arrived at Still Station in the middle of winter. They'd walked for days. The children's feet were frostbitten. The mother was sick. William Still arranged medical care. He found them warm clothes. He kept them hidden for 2 weeks while slave catchers searched Philadelphia. Then he arranged their transport to Canada. Years later, he received a letter from the mother. She'd found work. Her children were in school. They were building a life. She thanked him for saving them. Still kept that letter with his records. Another escape involved a young man named William Peel, who'd been hired out by his enslaver to work in Philadelphia. Peel was supposed to return to Maryland, but he contacted the Vigilance Committee instead. Still arranged for him to disappear. New clothes. Transport to New York, then Canada. Peel's enslaver came to Philadelphia looking for him, offering a reward. Still played dumb, said he'd never heard of anyone by that name. Peel made it to freedom. His enslaver went home empty-handed. Each escape required careful planning. Still had to assess each person's situation. How closely were they being pursued? What resources did they need? Where should they go? Some people could travel immediately. Others needed to hide in Philadelphia for days or weeks. Some had injuries that required medical attention. Others needed money for the journey north. Still coordinated all of it, managing resources, making decisions, taking responsibility for hundreds of lives. The work was constant. People arrived at all hours, middle of the night, early morning, during business hours when Still was supposed to be working his day job. He balanced his official duties at the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society with his underground work. He kept his records hidden. Some believe he communicated in code when necessary. He developed a network of safe houses across Philadelphia, homes where freedom seekers could hide. Some were black homes, some belonged to white Quakers and other abolitionists. Still knew them all, knew which ones were safest, which ones had been compromised. But William Still's most emotional moment came in 1850. A man arrived at his station, someone who'd purchased his own freedom. His name was Peter Still. William interviewed him, as he did everyone. He asked about his background, his family, where he'd come from. And as Peter told his story, William realized something impossible. This man was his brother. The brother who'd been left behind in slavery 40 years earlier when their mother escaped. The brother William had never met but had grown up knowing existed somewhere in the South. Peter had been enslaved in Alabama. He'd worked for decades, saving money, negotiating with his enslaver. The process had taken years. Peter had worked extra jobs, saved every penny, negotiated the price down. Finally, in April 1850, he'd paid the final $500 balance of his ransom through an intermediary named Joseph Friedman, a storekeeper in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Peter had bought himself. And then he'd traveled to Philadelphia, to the city where the Underground Railroad could help him, never knowing his own brother was running the station. Historical accounts say William Still was overjoyed. 40 years, 4 decades of separation, and now, against all odds, they were reunited. This wasn't just another successful escape. This was personal. This was family. This was proof that the impossible could happen, that families torn apart by slavery could find each other again. William and Peter spent hours talking, filling in the gaps of 40 years. Peter told stories about their mother, about the day she'd escaped, about what had happened to him and Levin Jr. After she left, William told Peter about their parents' life in New Jersey, about the family Peter had never known, about the siblings he'd never met. If William Still's reunion with his brother after 40 years moves you, hit that like button. It helps more people discover these stories of families torn apart by slavery and miraculously reunited through courage and determination. But the reunion wasn't complete. Peter Still's wife and children were still enslaved in Alabama. Peter had bought his own freedom, but he didn't have enough money to purchase his family. So William helped him raise funds. They organized speaking events. They told Peter's story to abolitionist groups. They collected donations. It took time, but eventually they raised enough money. Peter returned to Alabama and purchased his wife and 3 children. The entire family was reunited in freedom. It was a complete victory, the kind of outcome that seemed impossible, but happened because of persistence and community support. That reunion changed something in William Still. It wasn't that he hadn't been committed before, but now he knew, viscerally, what it meant to find someone you thought was lost forever. He intensified his efforts to reunite separated families. He used his records, his network, his connections to help people find their loved ones. He understood that freedom wasn't complete if you didn't know whether your mother, your children, your siblings were alive or dead, free or enslaved. He started including more detailed family information in his interviews. Where were you born? What were your parents' names? Do you have siblings? Where were they last? He was building a database that could reconnect families. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act made everything more dangerous. Before 1850, helping escaped slaves was illegal, but enforcement was inconsistent. The new law changed that. It required citizens to assist in capturing fugitive slaves. It denied alleged fugitives the right to a jury trial. It created financial incentives for commissioners to rule in favor of slave catchers. Commissioners received $10 if they ruled that someone was a fugitive slave, but only $5 if they ruled the person was free. The law was designed to make the Underground Railroad impossible. Suddenly, even free black people in the North could be kidnapped and sent south with minimal legal protection. But the Fugitive Slave Act had the opposite effect. It sparked increased resistance. William Still and other conductors didn't stop. They adapted. They became more careful, more strategic. They developed better codes, better communication systems. They moved people faster, farther north, often all the way to Canada, where American slave catchers had no jurisdiction. The law was meant to crush the Underground Railroad. Instead, it proved that you can't legislate away people's determination to be free. William Still's methodology was systematic. He maintained journals documenting every operation. He tracked Vigilance Committee expenditures, showing exactly how money was spent to assist freedom seekers. He corresponded with other conductors, coordinating routes and sharing information. He received letters from the people he'd helped, letters thanking him, updating him on their new lives in freedom. One abolitionist wrote to him, "William Still, dear friend and brother, 1,000 thanks for your good, generous letter. It was so kind of you to have in mind my intense interest and anxiety. This captures the emotional weight of the work. These weren't abstract operations, they were life or death situations, and everyone involved knew it." The bulk of Underground Railroad work and funding came from free black individuals like William Still, not white abolitionists. This is important to understand. The popular narrative often centers white abolitionists as the heroes of the Underground Railroad. But the reality is that black Americans, many of them formerly enslaved themselves, did most of the dangerous work, provided most of the funding, and took most of the risks. William was part of a network of black conductors who understood what was at stake because they'd lived it or their families had lived it. William Still's intelligence network was sophisticated. He knew which routes were compromised. He knew which slave catchers were operating in Philadelphia. He knew which safe houses were secure and which had been discovered. He coordinated with conductors in other cities, creating a communication system that moved information as quickly as it moved people. This required strategic thinking, careful planning, and the ability to make split-second decisions when plans went wrong. And plans did go wrong. People were captured, safe houses were raided, conductors were arrested. The work was never safe, never guaranteed. But William kept going. For over a decade, through the 1850s and into the early 1860s, he ran the Philadelphia station, helping hundreds of people escape, documenting their stories, building a historical record that would outlast the institution of slavery itself. Then the Civil War started in 1861. The conflict that would finally end slavery in America had begun, and William made a surprising decision. He left his position at the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. He stepped away from the Underground Railroad work that had defined his life for over a decade. Why? Because he saw a different opportunity. The Underground Railroad was becoming less necessary. Enslaved people in the South were escaping to Union lines, where they were considered contraband of war. The Union Army was becoming a de facto freedom network. The war itself was doing what the Underground Railroad had been doing for decades. Still recognized this shift. He understood that the war would end slavery as a legal institution, but he also understood that black Americans would need something else after the war. They'd need economic power. They'd need resources. They'd need successful role models who could prove that black people could thrive in business. So William opened a stove store. He purchased a coal yard. He started a coal delivery business. While the nation was tearing itself apart over slavery, William Still became a businessman. And he was good at it, really good at it. Philadelphia needed coal for heating. The war created demand. Still's business grew. He hired employees. He invested profits back into the business. He expanded his operations. His co-business grew increasingly profitable during and after the war. He invested in real estate. He purchased properties in Philadelphia. He rented them out. He built wealth systematically, the same way he'd built the Underground Railroad network, methodically, strategically, with attention to detail and long-term planning. By the time the war ended in 1865, William Still had transformed himself again, this time from Underground Railroad conductor to successful entrepreneur. Some people might see this as abandoning the cause, but William understood something important. Black Americans would still need economic power after slavery ended. They'd still need resources. They'd still need successful role models. Still was positioning himself to be that model. He was building the financial foundation that would allow him to continue fighting for civil rights in a different way. He understood that freedom without economic power was incomplete. You could be legally free but still trapped in poverty, still dependent on white employers, still vulnerable to economic exploitation. After the war ended in 1865, William still didn't retire and enjoy his wealth. He reinvested in his community. He served as a member of the Freedmen's Aid Commission, an organization helping formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. Think about what that meant. 4 million people who'd been enslaved were suddenly free, but they had no resources, no education, no land, no money. They needed help building new lives. They needed job training. They needed literacy education. They needed legal assistance. They needed protection from white Southerners who were already developing new systems of oppression to replace slavery. William still was there, using his experience and his wealth to assist them. He organized one of the first YMCAs specifically for black youth in Philadelphia. The YMCA movement was growing in America, but most YMCAs were segregated. Black young men needed their own spaces to gather, to learn, to develop skills. William still provided that. He helped fund the building. He served on the board. He made sure it had the resources to serve the community effectively. He helped manage homes for aged and destitute black children. These were children who had no families, no support systems. Some were orphans, some had been abandoned. They needed care, education, and a path to self-sufficiency. He assisted in running an orphan asylum specifically established for children of black soldiers and sailors who'd served in the Civil War. These men had fought for the Union, fought to end slavery, and many had died. Their children deserved care. William made sure they received it. This was institution building at its finest. Still understood that freedom wasn't just about escaping slavery. It was about building the infrastructure that would allow black communities to thrive. Schools, orphanages, community centers, businesses. These were the foundations of lasting freedom, and William still was helping construct them. He was thinking generationally, building institutions that would serve black Philadelphians for decades. But he hadn't forgotten the Underground Railroad. He hadn't forgotten those 800 people he'd helped, those stories he'd documented, those records he'd kept at such great personal risk. In 1872, 7 years after the war ended, William still published a book. He called it The Underground Railroad. And it was groundbreaking. This was one of the first published collections of direct testimonies from self-emancipated people, not stories told by white abolitionists about enslaved people, not second-hand accounts. These were first-hand narratives from the people who'd actually escaped, documented by someone who'd actually helped them. William drew on the extensive records he'd maintained during his years as chairman of Philadelphia's Vigilance Committee. He included excerpts from letters he'd received. He preserved the voices of people who would otherwise have been forgotten by history. The book was massive. Over 700 pages, it included dozens of individual stories, each one documented with names, dates, and details. William still organized it carefully, grouping stories thematically, providing context, explaining the operations of the Underground Railroad. He included his own observations and reflections. He explained the methods conductors used, the challenges they faced, the risks they took. He made the invisible visible, documenting a secret network that had operated in the shadows for decades. Why did he wait 7 years after the war to publish? Because even after slavery was legally abolished, publishing these stories was risky. Some of the people he'd helped were still alive. Some might still face danger from former enslavers seeking revenge. Some of the methods and routes he'd used might still be valuable for other kinds of resistance work. The Ku Klux Klan was terrorizing black communities in the South. Violence against black Americans was widespread. Still waited until he believed it was safe, until he believed the historical value outweighed the risks. The book was a success. It sold well. It was reviewed positively in abolitionist newspapers and journals. It established William Still as not just a conductor, but as the historian of the Underground Railroad. He'd lived the history and then preserved it. He'd been both participant and chronicler. And his book ensured that future generations would know the names and stories of people who'd fought for their freedom. According to Still's own account in the book, he wrote it because the race whose chains were broken deserved to have their stories told. He wanted Black Americans to know their own history of resistance. He wanted them to understand that enslaved people hadn't passively accepted their condition. They'd fought. They'd resisted. They'd risked everything for freedom. And he wanted white Americans to understand the brutality of slavery, the courage of those who escaped, and the sophistication of the network that helped them. The book included the story of Henry Box Brown, of course. It included Jane Johnson's rescue. It included Peter Still's reunion with his family. But it also included dozens of lesser-known stories. People whose names would have been lost to history if William Still hadn't documented them. A woman who escaped with her baby, walking for days through swamps. A man who hid in a ship's cargo hold for weeks. A family who disguised themselves as a white family, traveling with their servants. Each story was unique. Each demonstrated the ingenuity and determination of people fighting for freedom. William Still's post-war civil rights work extended beyond institution building and historical documentation. He fought to desegregate Philadelphia streetcars. This might not sound like a major issue, but think about what it meant. Black people in Philadelphia couldn't ride the same streetcars as white people. They had to walk or find alternative transportation. This was daily humiliation, daily reminder that even in the North, even after the Civil War, black people were still treated as second-class citizens. Still organized protests. He coordinated with other black leaders. They boycotted the streetcar companies. They filed lawsuits. They lobbied the state legislature. They made it a public issue, forcing white Philadelphians to confront the injustice. The campaign took years. The streetcar companies resisted. White passengers complained. But William Still and his allies persisted. Finally, in 1867, Pennsylvania passed a law prohibiting racial discrimination on public transportation. Philadelphia's streetcars were desegregated. It was a concrete victory, a tangible improvement in daily life for black Philadelphians. The streetcar campaign demonstrated William Still's strategic thinking. He understood that civil rights required multiple approaches: legal action, economic pressure, public advocacy, political lobbying. He coordinated all of these tactics, building coalitions, maintaining pressure, refusing to accept defeat. It was the same systematic approach he'd brought to Underground Railroad work, applied to a different challenge. His business continued to thrive. He became known as a black business mogul in Philadelphia, a city experiencing significant corruption during the Reconstruction era. Still built his reputation on integrity, on fair dealing, on providing quality service. He proved that black entrepreneurs could compete and succeed. He employed people, creating jobs for black Philadelphians. He paid fair wages. He treated his employees with respect. He demonstrated that economic success and civil rights activism weren't separate paths. They reinforced each other. William Still's wealth allowed him to be generous. He was described as a philanthropist in his later years, someone who gave back to his community. He donated to schools. He supported churches. He helped individuals who were struggling. He'd started with nothing, with limited education and limited opportunities. He'd built something substantial, and he used it to lift others up. He understood that wealth was a tool, a resource that could be used to create change. Throughout all of this, William still maintained correspondence with people across the country. He stayed connected to the network he'd built during his Underground Railroad years. He received updates from people he'd helped, learning about their lives in freedom. Some had become successful. Some had struggled. All of them remembered the man who'd helped them escape, who'd listened to their stories, who'd treated them with dignity when the law said they were property. One letter, preserved in his records, came from a woman he'd helped escape in 1856. She wrote to him in 1870, 14 years later. She told him about her children, about the school they attended, about the home she'd built. She thanked him for saving her life. She said she thought about him often, prayed for him, hoped he was well. William still kept that letter with hundreds of others, a collection of gratitude from people whose lives he'd changed. William still lived until 1902. He was 81 years old when he died. He'd been born when slavery was legal and widespread. He'd lived through the Underground Railroad era, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the beginning of the Jim Crow era. He'd seen slavery abolished and then seen new forms of oppression emerge. He'd fought throughout his entire adult life, adapting his methods as circumstances changed, but never abandoning the core mission: freedom, dignity, and opportunity for Black Americans. When he died, the New York Times obituary proclaimed him the father of the Underground Railroad. This wasn't a title he'd claimed for himself. It was recognition from history, acknowledgement that his contribution had been extraordinary. He'd helped as many as 800 enslaved people escape to freedom. He'd documented their stories. He'd preserved their names. He'd made sure they wouldn't be forgotten. But William Still's legacy goes beyond the numbers. It's about the methodology, the systematic approach he brought to resistance work. He didn't just react emotionally to injustice. He built a system. He created processes. He documented everything. He turned his personal trauma, the knowledge that his own siblings had been enslaved, into a machine for liberation. Think about what he did with limited resources. He had little formal education, but he educated himself. He started as a janitor and clerk, but he built a sophisticated intelligence network. He faced legal persecution, but he kept meticulous records anyway. He could have focused solely on his own success after the war, but he reinvested in his community. At every stage, still made choices that prioritized the collective good over personal safety or comfort. His story also reveals something important about the Underground Railroad itself. It wasn't a few heroic white people helping passive enslaved people escape. It was a complex network of Black Americans, many formerly enslaved themselves, who built an organized resistance movement. They funded it. They operated it. They took the risks. Still was part of that network, and his records prove how sophisticated and effective it was. The fact that William Still kept written records is still remarkable when you think about it. Every conductor knew that documentation was dangerous. Most destroyed any evidence. But William Still believed that preserving these stories was worth the risk. He understood that if no one documented what was happening, future generations wouldn't know. The enslaved people who escaped would become statistics, not individuals with names and stories and dreams. Still refused to let that happen. His decision to publish The Underground Railroad in 1872 was equally significant. He could have kept those records private, shared them only with historians, or destroyed them after the war. Instead, he made them public. He wanted everyone to know what had happened, how it had happened, who had made it happen. He wanted the self-emancipated people he'd helped to be recognized as the heroes they were. William Still's business success after the war demonstrates another form of resistance. Economic power matters. Financial independence matters. Still understood that Black Americans needed successful entrepreneurs, needed examples of people who could build wealth and use it for community benefit. He became that example. He proved it was possible, and he used his success to fund continued activism and community building. His institution-building work, the YMCAs, the orphanages, the homes for aged and destitute children, these weren't side projects. They were essential infrastructure for Black communities trying to establish themselves in freedom. Still saw the big picture. He understood that liberation required more than just escaping slavery. It required building the institutions that would allow Black communities to thrive for generations. Remember that question I asked at the beginning? How did someone with almost no formal education, working a menial job, build a system so effective that it saved hundreds of lives while outsmarting the most powerful slave catchers in America? Here's the answer. William Still succeeded because he combined three things that rarely come together. First, he had personal motivation that went beyond abstract principles. His own siblings had been enslaved. His mother had made an impossible choice. This wasn't theoretical for him, it was family. That personal connection gave him a depth of commitment that couldn't be shaken by danger or difficulty. Second, he brought systematic thinking to emotional work. He didn't just react. He built processes, kept records, created networks. He treated liberation as a project that required planning and documentation. Most people approach injustice emotionally, which is understandable. But William added strategy to emotion. He asked, what's the most effective way to help? How can we do this sustainably? How can we preserve what we're learning? That combination of heart and head made him extraordinarily effective. Third, he understood that his role was to preserve and amplify the courage of the people he helped. He didn't make himself the hero of the story. He made sure the self-emancipated people were recognized as the heroes they were. His book centered their voices, their stories, their courage. He was the facilitator, the documenter, the supporter. That combination is what made William extraordinary. Personal motivation plus systematic thinking plus humility about his own role. He turned his pain into purpose. He turned his limited opportunities into a platform for helping others. He turned his position as a clerk and janitor into the most important underground railroad station in Philadelphia. And here's what matters for you right now. William Still's story isn't just history, it's a blueprint. You don't need perfect circumstances to make a massive impact. You don't need formal credentials to build something important. You don't need permission from authorities to start helping people. What you need is clarity about your purpose, systematic thinking about your methods, and the humility to recognize that your role is to amplify others, not glorify yourself. Still started with almost nothing. Limited education, a menial job, a family history of trauma. But he had clarity. He knew what mattered. He knew who needed help. And he built a system that saved hundreds of lives and preserved their stories for history. Your circumstances are different, your challenges are different, but the principles are the same. Find your personal motivation, the thing that drives you beyond abstract principles. Apply systematic thinking to create sustainable impact. Focus on amplifying others rather than glorifying yourself. That's the formula. That's what William Still proved works. Think about your own life right now. What personal experience has given you insight that others need? What systematic approach could you bring to a problem that's usually handled emotionally? How could you use your current position, whatever it is, as a platform for helping others? You don't need to wait for perfect circumstances. You don't need to wait for permission. You need to start where you are with what you have. William Still was a janitor who became the father of the Underground Railroad. He was a clerk who became a historian. He was a son of escaped slaves who became a wealthy businessman and civil rights leader. He was someone with limited formal education who wrote a book that's still studied today. He transformed himself multiple times, adapting to changing circumstances while staying true to his core mission. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of William Still's story resonates most with you? What transformation are you working on in your own life? Let's learn from each other and continue the work of building systems that create lasting change.